The first thing I noticed wasn't the missing gravel, it was the silence. You know how a place you've called home for years has its own rhythm? The crunch of tires on stone, the mailbox leaning just enough that you've always meant to fix it, the old maple throwing shade across the driveway every afternoon. Well, all of that was gone. I had just gotten back from a 2-week fishing trip along the Oregon coast, tired in the best possible way, looking forward to sleeping in my own bed, when I pulled my pickup onto my road and almost drove straight into a fountain. Not my fountain, somebody else's. I slammed on the brakes, stared through the windshield, and honestly wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn. Where my driveway had been for decades now stretched a wide brick motor court with imported stone, iron lanterns, and enough polished landscaping to make a country club jealous. The entrance curved gracefully toward my neighbor's enormous estate like it had always belonged there. The only problem was, it hadn't. It was sitting exactly where my driveway used to be. My name's Grant Holloway, and until that afternoon I'd spent 58 years believing that no matter how strange people got, they still understood one simple rule. You don't take something that belongs to somebody else. Apparently my neighbor, Victor Langford, had never learned that lesson. Victor wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of wealthy that made ordinary millionaires look middle class. He'd made a fortune buying commercial real estate before turning 40. And after moving into our little hillside community, he'd spent the better part of 3 years turning an already impressive mansion into what he liked calling his legacy estate. Every few months, another construction crew rolled in. First came the glass conservatory, then the detached guest lodge, then an underground wine vault, then a luxury garage that looked nicer than most people's homes. He collected expensive cars the way some folks collected baseball cards, and every addition seemed designed for one purpose, reminding everyone within sight that he could afford whatever he wanted. At first, I tried giving him the benefit of the doubt. We all have that neighbor who pushes a little too far. One spring his landscaping company planted a row of boxwoods nearly 4 feet onto my property. Victor apologized with a smile, blamed the crew, and promised to move them. It took 3 months. Then his contractors started parking cement trucks on my gravel whenever they needed extra space. Again, another apology, another promise, another excuse. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth starting a war over. My father used to say that good neighbors were worth more than good fences, and I wanted to believe he was right. Looking back now, I realize every time I let something slide, Victor wasn't seeing kindness. He was measuring how much ground he could take before anyone pushed back. I climbed out of my truck and walked straight across those shiny new bricks toward the mansion. Victor stood near the entrance with a designer in an expensive linen jacket, both of them admiring the stonework like proud artists finishing a masterpiece. They saw me coming, but neither looked particularly concerned. "Victor," I called, louder than I meant to. "Where exactly do you expect me to drive?" He glanced over his shoulder with the kind of smile people wear when they're already convinced they're the smartest person in the conversation. "Grant," he said, spreading his arms toward the courtyard, "isn't it beautiful?" I looked from him to the fountain and back again. "That's my driveway." He chuckled, then folded his sunglasses into his shirt pocket. According to the survey I commissioned, it wasn't a legal driveway at all. Just an old access track that's been used for years without proper documentation. My attorneys confirmed everything. Technically, this area falls within a shared access zone. I've upgraded it for both of us. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You paved over my property while I was out of town." "No," he replied calmly. "I improved a neglected entrance. Frankly, I think you'll appreciate it once emotions settle down." I've never been the kind of man who loses his temper quickly, but I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "My garage is blocked," I said. "My truck can't even reach my house without driving through your courtyard." Victor shrugged. "Temporary inconvenience. These things happen during improvements." Then he turned back toward the designer as though our conversation had already ended. "Let's talk about the lighting around the fountain," he said, completely dismissing me. I stood there another moment, realizing I wasn't talking to someone who thought he'd made a mistake. I was talking to someone who genuinely believed my property had become his project. That afternoon I called the county planning office, then the assessor's office, then anyone else whose number I could find. Every answer sounded frustratingly similar. Victor's legal team had already filed surveys, boundary interpretations, and permit amendments thick enough to fill a filing cabinet. One clerk actually sighed before telling me, "Mr. Holloway, it'll probably take several weeks before everything can be reviewed." Several weeks. Meanwhile, my garage sat trapped behind a luxury courtyard built where my driveway had been for over 40 years. That evening, I parked along the county road and carried my groceries up the hill by hand. Halfway to the porch, I stopped and looked back at the glowing lanterns lining Victor's new entrance. He stood outside laughing with friends, pouring wine beside the fountain that now occupied the center of what used to be my driveway. I remember thinking I'd never felt so powerless standing on my own land. Then, after the sun disappeared behind the ridge and the house settled into silence, I climbed into the attic looking for something completely unrelated, and instead found a dusty cedar box that had belonged to my late grandfather, the man who helped lay out this entire neighborhood nearly 70 years earlier. Inside were yellowed subdivision maps, engineering sketches, handwritten notes, and one folded document that made me stop breathing for just a second, because in that moment I realized Victor hadn't stolen my driveway. He'd accidentally built his dream entrance on top of the one piece of land the city would never allow anyone to touch. I carried that cedar box downstairs like it was made of glass, spread every document across my kitchen table, brewed the strongest pot of coffee I could manage, and spent most of the night reading papers that hadn't seen daylight in decades. My grandfather, Walter Holloway, had been one of the civil engineers hired when Cedar Ridge was carved out of farmland back in the late 1950s. Unlike modern digital records, everything had been hand-drawn, every utility trench measured with remarkable precision, every easement carefully labeled in faded blue ink. The more I studied those maps, the more one thing became impossible to ignore. My driveway wasn't simply a driveway. It followed the exact alignment of what the original plans called Emergency Access Corridor B, a secondary route designed to allow fire engines and ambulances to reach the hillside homes if the main entrance was ever blocked. It had remained gravel all those years because city engineers wanted heavy emergency vehicles to have direct access beneath the surface where multiple utility corridors crossed the neighborhood. Then I unfolded another sheet, this one stamped by the Regional Utility Authority, and suddenly the entire picture snapped into focus. Directly beneath Victor's brand-new courtyard sat a major utility corridor carrying electrical conduits, natural gas mains, municipal water lines, fiber communication cables, and several underground access vaults. Permanent easements had been granted before a single house was ever built, meaning no private owner, no architect, and certainly no millionaire with expensive lawyers could legally obstruct them. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I just sat there staring at the map for several minutes because I realized how close Victor had come to creating a disaster far bigger than stealing a driveway. If one gas company technician couldn't reach a shutoff valve during an emergency, or if firefighters lost access to that secondary route, people could actually get hurt. That changed everything. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about correcting something dangerous before someone paid for it. Early Saturday morning, I walked the edge of Victor's courtyard carrying copies of the old plans. Most people would have seen decorative brickwork. I saw utility marker locations hidden beneath flower beds. I noticed a cast-iron valve cover buried under fresh sod, a faded electrical warning post leaning behind imported shrubs, and a concrete survey monument sticking barely an inch above the soil where landscapers had tried to disguise it with decorative gravel. Whoever built the courtyard hadn't removed the evidence. They'd simply covered it. I photographed everything from multiple angles, measured distances, compared coordinates to the original subdivision maps, and by lunchtime I had assembled a folder thick enough to rival anything Victor's attorneys had submitted. Monday morning started quietly. Too quietly. I called the Regional Utility Authority first, expecting voicemail or another endless transfer between departments. Instead, after I explained that permanent easement markers appeared to have been buried beneath a recently constructed motor court, the woman on the phone interrupted me halfway through my explanation. "Sir," she asked carefully, "are you saying someone built permanent structures over active utility infrastructure?" I answered yes. There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds. "Please don't disturb anything. We'll have someone there today." Next came the fire marshal's office. When I mentioned Emergency Access Corridor B, another silence followed before the dispatcher requested copies of every document I had. By noon I had emailed historical plats, engineering drawings, photographs, and property records to 3 separate agencies. Then I waited. Around 8:30 Tuesday morning, the first white utility truck rolled into the neighborhood. Then another. Then a pickup from the city engineering department. A fire marshal's SUV followed behind them, along with planning officials carrying clipboards and rolled blueprints. My neighbor Linda, who'd lived across the street almost as long as I had, peeked over the hedge and whispered, "Grant, did somebody call in the cavalry?" I smiled without taking my eyes off Victor's driveway. I think history did. Within minutes, orange safety cones surrounded the courtyard. Utility workers unloaded electronic locating equipment, while engineers compared digital maps against old survey coordinates. Victor stormed out of his front door wearing loafers and a polo shirt, clearly expecting to dismiss another contractor. "Excuse me," he barked. "What exactly is going on?" A city engineer introduced herself politely before explaining they were investigating potential easement violations. Victor actually laughed. "Impossible. My attorneys cleared everything," she answered with professional calm. "Then this inspection shouldn't take long." It took less than 20 minutes before the first problem appeared. One technician swept a locator over the brick surface, paused, adjusted the settings, then painted a bright orange line directly through the center of Victor's beautiful courtyard. Another worker marked blue lines crossing it from the opposite direction. Yellow paint followed for gas. Green appeared for sewer infrastructure. By the time they finished, the expensive imported bricks looked like someone had turned them into a giant utility coloring book. Victor's confidence faded a little more with every fresh stripe. Then the electrical supervisor walked over carrying an old easement diagram almost identical to the one sitting in my kitchen. "We've got an underground transformer vault beneath this section," he said, pointing directly under the decorative fountain. "Required maintenance clearance has been completely obstructed." The fountain suddenly didn't look nearly as impressive. Things unraveled quickly after that. Fire Marshal Denise Carter unfolded emergency response maps inside the back of her SUV before walking the original alignment of Corridor B. She stopped precisely where Victor's new stone retaining wall stood and looked back toward the street. "This wall blocks the required turning radius for emergency apparatus," she said to another inspector. Large fire engines couldn't reach 3 residences beyond this point. She measured, photographed, documented everything. Victor's architect arrived shortly afterward carrying rolled construction drawings under one arm, looking confident until city planners compared his approved permits against the original subdivision restrictions. Somewhere between revisions, assumptions, and expensive legal opinions, nobody had bothered verifying 70-year-old recorded easements that never expired. Victor eventually spotted me, standing near my mailbox. He marched across the grass, his face turning a deeper shade of red with every step. "You did this." It wasn't really a question. I reported what I found. I answered. "You buried it." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea what this project cost?" I looked past him toward the fountain sitting over an electrical access vault and replied quietly, apparently not enough to check what was underneath it. For a moment I thought he might actually apologize. Instead he pointed a finger toward me and said, "This isn't over." Before I could answer, the planning director called his name. "Mr. Langford, we'll need you to accompany us. There are additional concerns involving your guest lodge." His expression changed instantly. "What concerns?" "It appears your guest lodge occupies part of the designated fire access setback." He blinked. "That's impossible." "We'll know shortly." By early afternoon, inspectors had discovered one violation after another. The wine vault extended over a municipal water main requiring unrestricted access for maintenance. The home theater's foundation crossed a protected gas easement. Decorative stone planters blocked electrical junction access points. Even sections of the luxury landscaping violated required clearance distances around utility infrastructure. None of those problems existed because someone disliked Victor. They existed because decades before he bought the property, engineers had deliberately reserved those spaces for public safety, and those rights didn't disappear simply because expensive architecture covered them with prettier materials. 3 days later, the official notices arrived. Red tags appeared on sections of the property. Temporary restrictions limited vehicle access. Utility companies prohibited further use of portions of the courtyard until corrective work began. The City Planning Commission scheduled an emergency hearing. while Victor's legal team suddenly stopped returning reporters' phone calls after word spread through the neighborhood. Everyone had an opinion. Some blamed careless contractors. Others blamed arrogant lawyers. A few insisted the city should have caught the problem earlier. I mostly stayed quiet because I knew the biggest mistake hadn't been technical at all. Victor had spent years believing every obstacle could be solved with another consultant, another permit, another check written to the right professional. The one thing he never invested in was listening to the people who'd been there before him. And as I watched survey crews hammer fresh stakes into the ground where my driveway had once disappeared beneath imported brick, I had a feeling the most expensive part of this story still hadn't happened yet. The demolition crews showed up the following Monday, just after sunrise, and I'll admit something I'm not particularly proud of. I poured myself a cup of coffee, pulled an old wooden chair onto my front porch, and watched. Not because I enjoyed seeing another man lose money, but because for the first time in weeks I felt like the truth had finally caught up with the illusion. The fountain came out first. Workers disconnected the plumbing, wrapped chains around the stone basin, and lifted it away with a crane, revealing the concrete access vault that had been hidden beneath it all along. Then sections of imported brick disappeared pallet by pallet until the orange, blue, yellow, and green utility markings became exposed again. Every layer they removed seemed to uncover another reminder that the land had always belonged to something bigger than any one homeowner. Victor spent most of that morning arguing with engineers, insurance representatives, contractors, and eventually his own attorneys. I overheard fragments as people walked past my property. We relied on the survey. The easements were recorded. The permits don't override public infrastructure. Coverage has been denied. Nobody was yelling anymore. The confidence that had surrounded the project only a week earlier had been replaced by exhausted professionals trying to calculate how expensive the cleanup would become. Over the next 2 months, the mansion looked less like a luxury estate and more like an active construction site. Heavy equipment replaced imported sports cars. Utility companies excavated sections of the property to restore proper access around buried infrastructure. Crews removed portions of decorative retaining walls, relocated landscaping, and rebuilt service corridors according to the original engineering plans. The city required Victor to fund nearly every correction because investigators concluded the violations resulted from unauthorized construction that interfered with protected easements. Even neighbors who had admired the renovations started shaking their heads whenever another truck rolled into the driveway. One afternoon, Linda wandered over with 2 glasses of iced tea and quietly said, "You know, I always thought this was about the driveway." I smiled and looked toward the excavation crews. So did Victor. The truth was, the driveway had only been the first domino. Once inspectors started looking, years of shortcuts, assumptions, and overlooked restrictions began falling one after another. My own property slowly returned to normal. As part of the Emergency Access Restoration Project, the city rebuilt my driveway from the ground up instead of simply replacing the old gravel. They widened the entrance to modern fire standards, improved drainage along the hillside, reinforced the base to support emergency vehicles, and even installed proper lighting near the road. The project manager joked that I had accidentally ended up with the nicest driveway on the block. I laughed, but deep down I kept thinking about my grandfather. Those old maps sitting in a dusty cedar box had protected something he helped build almost 70 years earlier. History had quietly done what money couldn't. It reminded everyone that communities aren't held together by impressive houses or expensive landscaping. They're held together by agreements, responsibility, and respect for the people who come before us and the people who'll arrive long after we're gone. About 6 months later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Victor's mansion. Rumors traveled fast in a neighborhood like ours. Some people claimed he'd lost hundreds of thousands fixing the violations. Others insisted the legal bills had become even worse than the construction costs. I never asked because, honestly, it wasn't my business anymore. One cool autumn afternoon, I watched a moving truck pull away from the estate while Victor stood alone beside the front gate waiting for his driver. He noticed me walking to my mailbox, and, for the first time since we'd met, there wasn't any arrogance left in his face. He walked over slowly and stopped at the edge of my new driveway. "Grant," he said after a long silence, "I should have talked to you before I built all that." I looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," I answered, "you probably should have." Neither of us said anything else. There wasn't much left to say. Some lessons arrive as conversations. Others arrive attached to demolition equipment and legal notices. People still ask me if I feel like I won. The truth is, I don't think anybody really wins when neighbors stop seeing each other as neighbors. I'd gladly trade every new inch of concrete for the version of this story where someone simply knocked on my front door before making assumptions. Pride has a funny way of convincing people they're too successful to ask simple questions, and sometimes those unanswered questions become the most expensive decisions they'll ever make. Every now and then I drive across that rebuilt entrance and glance toward the mansion's new owners enjoying the property without any of the old drama. The fountain is gone. The oversized courtyard is smaller now, and emergency vehicles can once again reach every home on the hillside exactly as the original engineers intended decades ago. In the end, the driveway wasn't protected because I was stubborn, or because I had better lawyers, or because luck happened to be on my side. It survived because some things are built on principles that don't change when property values rise or fortunes grow. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Never assume the oldest piece of a neighborhood is the least important, because sometimes the quietest stretch of gravel is carrying the weight of an entire community. Now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered a wealthy neighbor had taken part of your property believing they could out-lawyer everyone around them, would you have fought the same way, or would you have handled it differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoy thoughtful neighborhood dramas with surprising twists and satisfying endings, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.